this up. See what we can do. See what we can do. All right. Looks like I got the live stream up. I hope you're doing well. If you're catching the very first part of this, just checking out things. I know we've got a lot going on this morning. Let's check out the YouTubes. Make sure we got good audio. And we do. Got a sharp picture today. Looks like I might have hit my camera last week or something. It was just a wee bit off. Just a tad thrown off. Yeah, well, I hope you're doing well where you are. I'm gonna fire up Discord and make sure I've got good visual on that to make sure we know when we are officially live on the internets. As it typically takes it a second to alert people that we're here. Close a few things down here while we're waiting on CouchBot to fire. And we've got an interesting day here. Couple different things I want to show you folks. I wonder where OBS is. Let's go full screen with that so we can quickly switch back and forth, which would be nice. It'd be super nice. I'm going to talk some front end stuff today too. So I'm looking at the analytics. Looks like CouchBot has not fired yet, so we're going to give that a second. A little later. Oh, there it is. A little later start this morning. Worst thing in the world, I think, is hold music. I was on hold for like a good 45 minutes trying to get something rectified this morning. Got it all sorted out, so we're good. And then, hey, looky there. CouchBot has fired. Just going to check one more time. And I do see some activity there. Hello, folks. Hi, how are you doing? Welcome into the live stream. So we're gonna go a couple of different directions today. One, Bren has been just like blasting through some of the front end material, and I want to touch on that because we've also made some updates to that material, and then I've been going back and forth with Alfonso on and actually part of this is Alfonso related, part of this is actually Jane related because there was a discussion last week about, hey, my client's wanting to use this font, but it's not really the font that they've been using, and here's the original that they were doing, and how do I talk to them about this odd mix that they were trying to put together? And I've got a couple thoughts on that I want to share. But without further ado, we should probably jump into this. So I'm going to go ahead and start so that we can get this out of the gate. Greetings, one and all. Chris Courtney here, New Pragmatics. Time for the feedback loop. Starting out a little later this morning. The worst thing in the world. Hold music. You're on a phone call. The do. It's terrible stuff. But I'm glad to be here with you now. So we got all that stuff out of the way. Bren's in here, and I've got something for Alfonso and Jane as well. This morning we're really looking at a lot of front end stuff. Bren's going through a lot of the front end material, and I want to talk about how we're applying styles to the challenges that we have ahead, and I want to look at some of the challenges that Bren's working through because I think it's helpful if we all look at them together. Yes, you may say, hey, but aren't you showing me some of the answers? And it's like, yeah, maybe, but you're gonna have to remember this, and when you do this in weeks from now, and you won't. I mean, you may try to come back and find this, but it'll be much easier just to write the solutions. So I'm just giving you exposure. It's just giving you exposure to the material. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. So the first place I want to start today is Identifont. This is a particularly cool site. I'm just going to blow this up just a little bit so we can see it. I'm just pinching and zooming on the browser. So what Identifont does, and it's literally just identifont.com. Identifont allows you to compare and contrast two typefaces. And this came up a couple of times last week, and I thought it would be nice to take a moment to call out why I go to sites like Identifont. When we talk about building type specimens in like type 201, part of what we're trying to do when we build our type specimens is we're trying to get into a place where we can compare the typography. And that has a real world consequence when it comes to designing for visual design and interface design, frankly. Um, this came up last week with Jane. She had a client who has an affinity for this font, Avenir. And while Avenir's great, I have no problem with it. The logo for that brand is actually in Active Grotesque. And the question that was coming across was, well, since their logo is actually set in something different than Avenir, should I be mixing the two? And on one hand, naturally I wouldn't gravitate to make that mix, because they're so close to one another that I worry that they're just not different enough to warrant using a different typeface if I've already got one that's ingrained in the branding. But the logo was done in such a way that it's very difficult to tell that the base typography is Active Grotesque. So they had made line work, and they'd really deconstructed the typography. So even though that typography was Active Grotesque, it wasn't apparent by looking at it that it was Active Grotesque. So the usage of Avenir in that case was fine. But when you sit down with a client and you're talking about, oh, this typography is close, but it's not different enough, you want to be able to compare them. And when you sit down and compare Avenir and Active Grotesque, like we're doing here, a couple things should stand out. One, there are certain characters, like the Q here, has a much different tail than the Q of Active Grotesque. The Q of the Active Grotesque actually crosses over. The Q of Avenir actually kind of, and it's weird because they show an alternative Q here, but this actually almost looks like a roll of tape. It's very bizarre, to be completely honest with you. The more apparent thing, though, and Identifont doesn't really touch on this, is when you look at these, it should be very apparent that Active Grotesque is a much narrower character than Avenir. You can see it right away when you look at the ABCs here in uppercase. Like, you can fit more characters on the first line with Active Grotesque than you can with Avenir. That's simply the fact that Avenir is a much broader font. It's also important to notice how much larger Avenir is. Like, when you look at the cap size, so if you were to set Active Grotesque at 24 pixels, and you were to set Avenir at 24 pixels, Avenir is going to look a couple of pixels larger, just naturally, because it's set a little larger. Interestingly enough, the X height on Active Grotesque is larger than the X height on Avenir. You can look at the ascender on the B and the D, and you can see that, like, they have very short ascenders by comparison with the bottom half, like the X height. But you look over here to Avenir, and the ascenders here are basically like half. It's like the X height is half of the total character height. So with Active Grotesque, it's like 70%. With Avenir, it's like 50%. Now, that's going to play a role when you get into smaller typography, because the smaller that X height, the more difficult it is to read. Now, I will say that X heights that are like ridiculously large, like they're 80% of the total character height, those aren't easy to read either, because you begin to question whether what shape is that character. But when you're talking about X height of like 50% versus X height of like 65-70%, I'm always going to be in the camp of, the larger X height for smaller size typography. Um, then there's a few other things that not active grotesque, but that Identifont gives you that you don't necessarily get in other places. Um, I like how it points out the diagonal strokes of the K versus that diagonal strokes here that just kind of meet evenly on Avenir. Look at the square dots that are used on the question mark and the eye. Are you looking for something that's curved or something that is very angular? Um, Again, we've talked about this. The O is taller than it is wide. The O appears circular. This means that Avenir is much more, frankly, mechanical. It's like perfect geometry, where active grotesque is a little more natural because it's not. It's imperfect. Um, and then another thing that drives a lot of people nuts is the fact that the height of the lowercase elements, like the I, the J, the K, and the L, are all the same with active grotesque, but they actually have a different height in Avenir. And the interesting thing there is that should be obvious to us. We because you know the I and the J, they don't have ascenders, and because the X height is lower in Avenir, that's going to lead to a different overall height of lowercase characters versus what you're seeing over here in active grotesque. I'm not making a judgment call on one is better than the other, but I do like having tools like Identifont available for us to plug in different typography and compare it really quickly, when you don't necessarily have time to build up a full specimen where you're studying the font in depth. Sometimes you just need to compare two fonts really fast. Maybe you need to show a client something. The one thing I'll say about Identifont is it doesn't work with everything. So I plugged in some stuff from Google Fonts and didn't work all the time. So the depth of the number of fonts that you can plug in there is not quite as deep as I would like. But all the standards that you might, all the popular typefaces that you might consider using are there. If you pull off some rando thing off Google Fonts that has one weight, it's probably not going to be an Identifont, but something like Avenir and Active Grotesque both are pretty popular. You're going to find those here. Okay? So let's move on over here to Bryn's questions. So Bryn is working on a number of different projects. Actually, if we go into her journal, she worked on 4 exercises over the weekend. Some of these are really well done, and obviously, Bryn, I know that we discussed these earlier. She basically was working through I pointed out to her that this is actually the Twitter navigation sidebar that we recreated. And part of the trick with this exercise is you're simply adjusting the CSS to make the existing CSS apply. And as she found out here, this was really just making sure that LI was targeting the anchor tag. Now we pulled 2 characters away, and it went away, comes back, and that's because all of these styles need to be applied to the anchor tag. When you haven't applied those styles to the anchor tag, you get a lot of the standard sizing and underline, and these things are the color of the type is that dark blue, because it's that's what anchor tags are typically carrying with them just by the nature of being anchor tags. So if you want to overwrite that, you have to specifically target it. And we had these styles written. You just needed to target because of the way this is structured. LIs have a child of the anchor tag, so we needed to write that child selector. And if you're wondering, if you're watching this and you're like, I have no idea how he got to that solution, just know that this is part of the selectors exercises, CSS selectors, and in the front end design course. So if you're wanting to dive in deeper to CSS, just know that those exercises are there. So she worked through the selectors exercise. She had more questions about this one though, and this is the brick house. This is something that I see happen quite a bit, where we begin when you're first getting into front end design. You begin to and you're trying to apply styles. So I've given you all the styles, right? We sometimes become lost in how to target things. Okay, so some of your, here we have a universal selector, we have section, intro, H1, intro, credit, grid left. Grid left has a grid left. The grid template columns have been overwritten because this is CSS cascading. So like while we dictated this earlier to be applied to grid left, we then came through and rewrote grid template columns. Grid div, grid left div. So this is saying I want to target divs that have a class of grid, and this is interesting because so if we go into the HTML, the class of grid is being applied here, and it's to a div. So we don't necessarily need the grid div to be targeted because we've already, by virtue of this div existing here, we already are targeting. So class of grid, give me the divs. So that means that one's unnecessary as well, and this one's unnecessary as well, because those are not classes. Okay, the divs are not classes, and as you can see, like nothing changes when I remove that away, because this would be impacting this shape right here. When I remove that away, nothing happens because it's not a class; it is a div. And when I target grid div, it's targeting these divs that are inside of this class of grid. Same thing down below. Now this is interesting. You've applied grid here, and I really don't believe that you need grid there, because you've already grid is and it's interesting, you've got grid left here as well. So if we remove that, and for those following along that are wondering, okay, so what is he adjusting to? Let me go to the comments. We have this PNG here. This is the final exercise that she's trying to get to. And as you can see, there is a structure that is wide left, wide right, wide left. So this, if we look at this again, let's close that down. This is grid left, and then remove these divs as well. Now you might be wondering, what is light doing here? Well, light is giving us the ability to bounce that change of color. If we remove light, what you'll see is that all the blocks are the same color, and light is simply allowing that to be overwritten, because the color over here on your CSS probably being dictated by, so this is, where are we dictating that color? I see underline. I see div light. That's the lighter. And I really don't think you need div there. You probably can just get. Maybe you do. Looks like you do. Where is that dark green coming from? Does anybody see it? Oh, background green. I was looking for a hex code or an RGB, and I did not see it. But as you can see there, it's first set there. When light comes in, it overwrites it. So that's what allows it to move around. And then there's underline. And underline is uniquely different. And this is the first time that Bren was encountering an ID, and that obviously has to be placed differently than the others, because everything else is a class here. This is an ID, and that is simply saying on this one block I want a border to the bottom. Okay, so pretty well done there, Bren, overall. You'd had a question about this intro though, and right now you've got an intro H1. Again, this is like the divs. The H1 is not a class. It is an HTML tag. All right, so I've got a div, a class of intro, and if I've got some CSS written here that says H1 after it for intro, which I'm guessing, yeah, I do right here. So I'm simply saying inside of a class of intro, if I have an H1, do these things. All right, so here I have a class of intro, and that class of intro begins here and it ends down there. So everything in here is going to take the stylings from intro. I don't necessarily need it here. And that gives you the wider display of the typography like you have here. So overall, what I'm seeing here, Bren, is that you're consistently applying the HTML tags that are called in your CSS, like intro H1. You're basically targeting them here, but that's unnecessary because that's not how the CSS is working. The CSS is saying, hey, I've applied a class of intro. Go find me the H1s that are contained within. If I twist that down, you'll see the H1 is within this class of intro. So it's being targeted. And that's what's happening here when you have this setup. It's saying, when I've applied the class of intro, find me the H1s that are inside. All right? And if you can remember that, I think you'll be better off. But also notice that nothing really broke. All right? So it's not like you had a lot of broken code here. If there's no style associated with the like the way that it was seen is like, oh, you have a class of H1 that you would also like to apply here. And then it looks at the CSS and it goes, there is no class of H1. I guess she's just being silly. So it's not like it broke anything. It's just it looks poor when you're reviewing it. You're like, why would she name a class H1? And then you look at the CSS like, there's no class name H1. What's going on? And this is just you beginning to work through the exercises. All right. And again, I gave you a lot of CSS that was already written, and this is your first time trying to apply pre-written CSS to work that you're doing. Okay. One interesting thing that I want to point out is like when we note out box sizing, border box, notice how the underline changed. Like the underline now these don't line up. That's going to come into play here in just a moment, because border box basically says any padding, the box width, the padding, and the border all are part of the same piece. Like, so when we add these things together, and we're going to talk about box model in just a moment, when we add these things together, they add up to 100% of the box width, and then margin is outside of that. When you take border box away, now it's adding that in addition to the box width or height, So border is no longer considered part of the sum. It's something that's added to the overall size of the box. Where here it's considered, okay, this is this part of the box itself. Let's take a look at this exercise right here, because this is where this is going to come into play. So right now you've got a design, and if we go through and let's go to comments and look at the actual design here. So the design that we have here is attempting to, it's like a 2-column design, and it's basically the width of the page. What do we need to do to make this work? And if we look at your design, obviously there's a few problems. As we shrink this down, notice that like the order now button is like all the way at the edge, and that's not great. And there's also this bit of text here, so something's up there. The first thing that I would do is I would ask, okay, where's border box at? Because if this is a box model exercise, and I go through here and I say, okay, well, I know that universal selector's got to come in, so I'm going to say border box, and you know, it's box size and border box. And actually, you know what? And I encourage you to do this. When there's something you're trying to write, just paste it in. So, you know, here, what property are we targeting? Box sizing. And how are we targeting it? What are we doing to it? Border box. Okay, so that's helpful. So we've got border box set up now in this, and that doesn't look like it changed a lot. One of the issues that I think we've got right now is, let's take a look at your button. So right now we've got a lot of margin on this, and this margin is kind of pushing around inside of that shape. So you've got margin to the bottom of the button and margin to the left, and that's why this isn't lining up. So I'm going to first pull out that margin left, and now that's lining up to the edge of the box. And now I'm going to pull out margin bottom, and now that's to the bottom of the box. And now I'm going to make this width 100%. Okay, so now our button is the full width of the box that it's in. All right, so now let's come back here to, let's see here. You've got, and I always come through and I like twist these down so I can see the code a little better. I thought it was 3. There's 2 boxes on the screen, Chris. So you've got a div class of flex, and the class of flex here is really, it's really just making sure that everything here aligns. So let's take a look at this and see what's going on. So right now, it's interesting. I see, you know, I want to try to get this to 100%. So right now this is 36. If I say 44, and then there's 6 to each side, the margin is 3 to each side. So 44 plus 6 equals 50. So that gives me the 100% width that I'm kind of looking for here. And then now I'm looking at this and wondering, how are we handling, is it padding? Okay, so now I've got my border set for the button. I've got to look at what's happening here with the div. And the div here has a width of 85. If I set that to 100, That's closer. Kind of trying to pick this back apart to see where the issues are. Oh, there's a padding. Okay, so on the description, there's now padding of 20 pixels. If I remove that away, okay, so I bet there's a lot of padding all the way through. Yep. Okay, there's type. It's that, so we need to get, okay, yeah, you've got all sorts of little weird padding here, which is not uncommon, by the way. I've seen this a lot, where very early on, as you begin to write your code, and you can talk with Maddie about this, we need that UL. The UL must have some padding on it. Nope, not the UL, but the LI does. Okay. Although it is interesting, can we get that to stack? There we go. Let's go back and look at the target. So that wasn't, so margin right, if we come in and say 10 pixels on the LIs, that's going to insert space between these. And now they're kicking over. And you can come out and now they're all there. There is also a min height setup here. That's why these cards are the size that they are. Where is that min height at? Yeah, min height of 200 pixels. If we change that to 150, it changes the design of this a bit. And then as this gets longer, you can see that these are now no longer the same size. Also, we've got this weird, like, the ULs are beginning to run in. So you could either, add margin top. I would probably add margin top to the button. Margin top. Let's just say 10 pixels or 20 pixels. And essentially this is going to push the button down just a bit. But the goal here is so that as these change in size, it never runs into that button now. But regardless, this is a common issue that you're fighting here, Bren, in that you were applying margin, like this is margin left 20 pixels, and that was kicking this in, and then you were basically coming through and manually adjusting everything that was inside of that box, when all you really needed to do was adjust up here. And if I want to make this all, if I want to make this have a really broad border all the way around it, like a clean air, I could just change it there. Or if I wanted to make it very minimal, I could change it here. Okay. The thing that I want you to think about when you're writing CSS is, how can I control spacing at a very high level? And here, the highest level that I'm focused on is the div that wraps all the content. So all, by associating, by really applying the padding to the class of flex, this is helpful because it applies that spacing to Polo Express, to the restaurant, to the description, to the methods, dine-in, curbside pickup and delivery, to the button itself. Like, it applies to everything. So now I'm not having to go through I'm not having to go through and adjust every single element that's inside of that div. I can adjust the entire div. And this is why this will make your code a lot less brittle. And what I mean by brittle is when we go through and adjust each line, especially when it comes to width, because we do a lot of this sort of thing where, it's on a phone or it's on a desktop or whatever. Depth I'm less concerned about. Like, if you wanted to go through and say, chicken restaurant, and I've got a class of type on that, because they're both p tags. So if I come down to type and I say, oh, I want the margin bottom to be 20, well, that's going to make the margin larger, right? So that space just got larger. But if I'm adjusting the width, like that's a unique spot that isn't trying to line up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different elements. It's just space between two elements. So I'm fine with it when you're just aligning between a couple of elements. Um, I'm less fine with it when you are attempting to. I'm less fine with it when you're attempting to make something align with a number of elements, and the moment you move one thing, you've got to move everything else. At that point, just ask yourself, okay, can I apply something to the container that this is in to control it, rather than individually adjusting items? And there'll be people that will say, oh, hey Chris, why are you showing them CSS? Why don't you show them Sass, or why don't you show them JavaScript or CSS and JavaScript? And it's like, well, that's great, y'all, but what I'm really talking about here is just fundamentals of how we think about applying. I don't care if you use SCSS or Sass, or you're writing in React and you're putting your CSS into your JavaScript. I don't care about any of that. What I care about is when you apply styling and spacing, you're applying it to the top level element to make that code, to write as little code as you can, really, because when you think about it, if you applied margin here, 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 and here, you've written 5 lines of code, right? That you could have just easily taken care of with a little padding right here. All right? So, and that's not me bagging, by the way, because I know for a fact when I first started writing CSS, I wrote some janky CSS where I individually tried to push everything around because I was just trying to make it work. All right? I totally get that. But the reason why I want to have these conversations out in the open is because I think it's helpful to remember that when I style something, I should be trying to do it at a level that is applied to as many different assets as possible, so that I'm not writing individual styles on individual elements. And again, I just had this conversation with Maddie. So Maddie, if you're watching this, Maddie's ears are probably ringing just by this conversation alone. All right. I like it. But good job overall. You got this a lot closer than where'd it go? Yeah, good job overall. You got this pretty close, Bren. And I that's where we're going to wrap it up today. So when you're writing CSS, fundamental thing is try to write as little CSS as you can in a way that impacts as many elements as possible while still achieving your goal. All right, you shouldn't dumb down what you're trying to do just to write simple CSS, but writing good CSS is writing as little as you possibly can. And there are a lot of different ways that you can go about developing good habits. One of the simplest things that I can say to you is that when we think about design, I always go back to that there was a tweet that I saw where somebody said, I went through two years of design school before I figured out that 80% of design is just lining stuff up. It's much easier to line stuff up when you are controlling the overall container. So think about that when you're in this, like if you're like creating stuff in Figma, or if you're creating wireframes and you're drawing some simple wireframes out. You don't want to create things that have lots of individual little embellishments that are going to be complicated to both build and consume as a user. We want to streamline these things, because at the end of the day, we're in the business of delivering information and content to people, in a way that it's consumable, so that they don't have to work very hard to get the value out of what we're delivering. And so often that means, hey, simplify this down to where the design does its job and it delivers the information when and where it's needed, rather than trying to work in all these embellishments. Now, there's a time and a place to be really creative, but on the taqueria card for like Yelp, that's not the place. All right, so that's going to wrap it up for today's edition of the Feedback Loop. Thanks for following along. Bryn, thanks for submitting so many exercises. It's always good to see that. For Jane and Fonzo, I hope that like Identifont helps you out as you're doing live comparison of typography. And for the rest of you, if you got any value out of this video, consider hitting that subscribe button. If you're looking for mentorship, listen to what my friends here from New Pragmatic have to say. I'll chat with you later.